3,000 meters beneath the surface, China has spent the last decade quietly building the underwater Great Wall, and the United States Navy is starting to admit that the ocean they have ruled for 80 years is no longer theirs alone. So, let's dive in. This is the South China Sea. It's a stretch of ocean about 3.5 million square kilometers wide, sandwiched between China to the north. From a satellite, it looks unremarkable. Blue water, a few scattered island chains. But 3,000 meters below the surface, hidden under that blue, China has been quietly building something that has no precedent in the history of naval warfare. The official name of the program is the Underwater Great Wall. It also has a second name, the Underwater Monitoring System. And it has a third name that almost sounds like a joke, Good Wind Ears, or the All-Knowing Ones. That third name is the one the engineers seem to like most, and once you understand what the system actually does, you can see why. The wall isn't a wall in the way you'd picture one above ground. It isn't a barrier. It isn't even something you can easily point at on a map. It is a network. The bottom layer of it is anchored to the seafloor at depths of up to 3,000 meters. It is made up of passive sonar arrays, which are essentially extremely sensitive underwater microphones. Connected to those arrays are active sonar systems, which can ping outward and listen for echoes. Stitched between all of it are miles and miles of fiber optic cable running along the floor of the ocean like the veins under skin. The cables connect to coastal anchor points, which sit on the artificial islands that China has constructed in the Spratly archipelago. Above the seafloor sits a second layer made of moving parts. Remote-controlled underwater drones, robotic submarines, buoyancy gliders that can patrol for months at a time without needing fuel. Above them sits a third layer of unmanned surface vessels and smart buoys that float on top of the ocean, soaking up data from below and beaming it back to shore. And above all of that sits a satellite constellation called Ocean Star Cluster, which scans wide stretches of water from space and tells the lower layers when to wake up and where to look. 5 layers: sea, water column, surface, space, and a central command system that ties them all together. The Chinese military has a name for that command system. They call it the Deep Blue Brain. To understand why this network is so unusual, you have to understand how strange the deep ocean actually is. The pressure increases by 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth, which means that at 3 kilometers down, anything you put in the water is being squeezed by 300 times the air pressure at sea level. The walls of an ordinary metal box would crumple like an empty soda can. And on top of all of that, the water itself is extraordinarily dark and cold, and almost completely empty. The deep ocean is the closest thing on Earth to outer space. A submarine could disappear into it for months at a time and then reappear somewhere else without warning. That space, that physical room for an entire warship to vanish, has been the foundation of nuclear deterrence and great power balance for 3 generations. What China is doing is filling that space with eyes and ears. And that brings us to a sensor sitting at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Because in December of 2017, the Chinese Academy of Sciences quietly revealed something that they had been doing in secret since 2016. They had placed 2 acoustic listening devices in some of the most remote underwater locations on the planet. The first one was at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the southern end of the Mariana Trench, 10,916 meters below sea level, the deepest known point on the surface of the Earth. The second was placed near a small island called Yap in the Federated States of Micronesia, just west of the trench. And here's the geography that started making people in Washington nervous. Yap is approximately 500 kilometers southwest of Guam. The Challenger Deep is about 300 kilometers southwest of Guam. And Guam, as you may have heard, is home to the largest American military base in the Western Pacific. It's where Submarine Squadron 15 is stationed. It's where the Los Angeles-class nuclear attack submarines tie up for resupply. The USS Oklahoma, the USS Chicago, the USS Key West, the USS Topeka. These two acoustic sensors that China had quietly planted were within range of all of them. Now, these are not normal microphones. According to the head of the deep-sea surveillance program at the Chinese Academy, a scientist who is identified in interviews only by the surname Zhu, these devices have a listening range of more than 1,000 kilometers. They can pick up acoustic signatures from over 620 miles away. The pair of them together creates what amounts to a giant ear pointed directly at the United States Navy's primary Pacific staging base. Their official purpose is scientific. They're listening for earthquakes, tracking whales, monitoring undersea volcanic activity. And it would be wrong to say that's a complete lie. They probably do all of those things. But sound doesn't discriminate. And submarines make noise. And the same sensor that can hear a tectonic plate shifting 700 kilometers away can also hear the propeller of a nuclear submarine leaving Apra Harbor. Here's what makes the technology actually impressive. To build a hydrophone that can survive at 12,000 meters of depth, where you're being crushed by pressures equivalent to over 1,000 atmospheres, requires materials and electronics that almost no country in the world can produce. Zhu, the program lead, mentioned in one interview that there's an export embargo to China on any sound detector with an operational depth beyond 1,000 meters. That means China couldn't simply buy this kind of sensor on the open market. They had to develop it themselves. And they did. The sensors are small. They consume very little power. They're attached to long fiber optic cables that run along the seafloor. The cables connect to small surface buoys carrying satellite communication equipment. And those buoys hold more than a year's worth of battery power for the sensors below. It's a closed system, almost invisible, and it had been operating for 2 years before anyone outside China knew it existed. But 2 listening devices near Guam was just the warm-up. The actual underwater Great Wall, the one being built across the South China Sea, is something on a completely different scale. The total announced cost of the initial system is 2 billion yuan, which works out to about 313 million US dollars. The contractor is the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, or CSSC, which is one of the most powerful military-industrial entities in the country. CSSC builds virtually every PLA Navy warship. They are not a civilian science group. They are the backbone of Chinese naval construction. And in December of 2015, they announced publicly that they were going to build the network. The proposal was for a system of ship and subsurface sensors capable of, in their own words, real-time location and tracing of surface and underwater targets. They listed the components: surface ships, sonar systems, underwater security equipment, marine oil and gas exploration equipment, unmanned underwater equipment, marine electronic equipment. Each of those phrases is doing more work than it sounds like. Underwater security equipment, for example, includes the kind of sensor net that the United States deployed during the Cold War to track Soviet submarines. That Cold War system was called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. SOSUS consisted of fixed hydrophone arrays placed along the seafloor at strategic choke points across the North Atlantic and the Pacific. It was so effective that for decades it could track Soviet submarines from the moment they left port. It is widely considered one of the most decisive technological advantages the US Navy ever had. And what the Chinese have built is essentially their own version of SOSUS, except deeper, denser, more networked, automated with AI, and pointed in the opposite direction, at the United States. Of course, listening devices on the seafloor are only one part of the wall. The truly novel piece of the system is the moving layer above them. China has been developing underwater drones in massive numbers, and one class in particular is worth slowing down for. They're called Haiyi, or Sea Wing. They are a type of buoyancy glider. The way a buoyancy glider works is one of the more elegant ideas in modern oceanography. Most submarines and underwater drones use propellers. Propellers consume electricity, which means batteries run out fast and operational range is short. A buoyancy glider doesn't have a propeller. Instead, it has internal compartments that pump oil in and out, changing its weight relative to the surrounding water. So the glider sinks, then it rises, then it sinks again. And as it does that, water flows over its small wings, and the angle of those wings converts the vertical motion into forward motion. It glides through the ocean the same way a paper airplane glides through the air, except the paper airplane is going up and down repeatedly. Because no power is being used for propulsion, a glider can operate for months without recharging. It can survey huge areas of the ocean, and it can do it almost completely silently. There are no propellers to make noise. There is no engine to give it away. It just slides through the water, breathing in and out, gathering data. A sea wing carries an array of sensors that read the conditions of the water around it. Acoustic profiles, ocean currents, dissolved oxygen, biochemical signatures. All of those readings matter for scientific research. They also matter, very specifically, for tracking submarines. And this is the part that took a long time for outside analysts to understand. Because at first glance, it seems like measuring water temperature has nothing to do with detecting a nuclear-powered warship. But sound waves do not travel uniformly through water. They bend, they reflect. They speed up and slow down depending on temperature, salinity, depth, and the shape of the seafloor underneath. To detect a submarine accurately, you don't just need a microphone. You need a complete model of the water that submarine is hiding in. The microphone listens for the sound. The model tells you what the sound means. The gliders are building the model. In December of 2020, fishermen off the coast of Indonesia found something strange in their nets. It was about 2 meters long, painted yellow, and shaped like a small torpedo with 2 wings. They had no idea what it was. They turned it over to the Indonesian Navy, who turned it over to investigators, who eventually identified it as a Chinese-made Sea Wing glider. It wasn't the first one to be recovered. It was at least the 3rd found in Indonesian waters. The official Chinese position is that the gliders are conducting scientific research. But the locations where they keep being recovered in the narrow waters of the Indonesian archipelago just happen to be the exact passages that any US Navy submarine would have to swim through to reach the South China Sea from the Indian Ocean. There are not that many ways to get into the South China Sea by submarine. If you map the gliders to the choke points, the picture stops looking quite so scientific. Above the gliders sits another moving layer: smart buoys, wave gliders, unmanned surface vessels. These act as routers in the network. Underwater data transmission, as a fact of physics, is incredibly difficult. Sound waves carry data slowly. Electromagnetic waves don't penetrate water at all. So if a sensor at 3 kilometers of depth wants to send what it heard back to a command center on shore, there has to be something in between to translate the message. That's what the surface relays do. They sit on top of the water, waiting for acoustic signals from below, then convert those signals into high bandwidth bursts that get sent up to satellites or out across cellular networks. Without that surface layer, the deep sensors are basically deaf to the rest of the world. With it, the network becomes almost a single nervous system. Seafloor listens, glider moves, buoy translates, satellite forwards, command center decides. Now, the next part of the story is the part that took the most time for outside observers to put together. Because while CSSC was openly announcing the underwater Great Wall, dozens of Chinese research vessels were quietly doing something else. They were mapping the seafloor. Earlier this year, in a long investigation published by Reuters, journalists reviewed 5 years of movement data from 42 Chinese research vessels operating in the Pacific, Indian, and Arctic Oceans. They used a ship tracking platform built by a New Zealand company called Starboard Maritime Intelligence. And the patterns they found were almost too consistent to be accidental. The ships moved in tight, parallel back and forth lines, the way you'd mow a lawn. That motion is the signature of detailed seabed surveying. At least 8 of the ships had publicly conducted seabed mapping. Another 10 carried the equipment for it. And the locations they were mapping were not random. They were the underwater approaches to militarily critical waters. The seas around Taiwan, the waters near Guam, the approach to Hawaii, the northern Pacific around Wake Atoll, where the US military maintains another base, an underwater ridge near a naval facility in Papua New Guinea that the United States recently gained access to. The waters around Christmas Island, an Australian territory that sits on the route between the South China Sea and Australia's main submarine base. One ship in particular stands out. It's called the Dongfang Hong 3. The name translates roughly as "The East is Red." It's operated by Ocean University of China. Throughout 2024 and 2025, it spent month after month sailing back and forth in the seas near Taiwan and Guam, and through strategic stretches of the Indian Ocean. In October of 2024, it visited and serviced a set of powerful Chinese ocean sensors near Japan. In May of 2025, it returned to the same area. In March of 2025, it crisscrossed the waters between Sri Lanka and Indonesia, mapping the approach to the Strait of Malacca. According to the university, the ship was conducting mud surveys and climate research. According to a scientific paper co-written by Ocean University academics, the same ship was also performing extensive deep-sea mapping. Both things are true. That, in a single sentence, is the entire structure of how the program is being built. The Chinese government has a phrase for this. It's called civil-military fusion. Under President Xi Jinping, the official policy is that scientific research and military development are not separate things. A research vessel collecting data on whale migration is also collecting data on the acoustic conditions a submarine would use to hide. A glider gathering ocean salinity is also calibrating the sound wave physics that determines whether sonar will work. Civilian and military are not parallel tracks. They're the same track. In 2017, government officials from Shandong province, where much of this research is based, said openly that the project was intended to ensure maritime defense and security. They explicitly compared their effort to the US military's own ocean sensor network. It is not exactly hidden. It's just usually not on the front page. The underlying ambition has a name. It was first proposed around 2014 by a scientist at Ocean University named Wu Lixin. He called it the Transparent Ocean. The idea was to deploy enough sensors across enough water to give China a comprehensive view of conditions and movement through any chosen area of the sea. The Shandong provincial government almost immediately put $85 million behind it. The project began in the South China Sea, where Ocean University now claims it has built an observation system covering the entire deep-sea basin. From there, it expanded to the Pacific, then to the Indian Ocean. Wu, the man who started all of this, now oversees the network through the Qingdao National Laboratory for Marine Science and Technology. The official partners of that laboratory include China's Naval Submarine Academy. The scale of what has been deployed is genuinely staggering. According to records from the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources, Ocean University, and the Shandong government, China has deployed hundreds of sensors, buoys, and subsea arrays across the Pacific Ocean, east of Japan, east of the Philippines, and around Guam. In the Indian Ocean, documents from the Chinese Academy of Sciences describe a sensor array ringing India and Sri Lanka, including along an underwater mountain range called 90 East Ridge. 90 East Ridge happens to be one of the longest undersea mountain ranges on the planet. and it sits directly across the approach to the Strait of Malacca. This is the moment in the story where everything connects. Because to understand why China cares so much about hearing what's underneath the South China Sea, you have to understand the problem that started this entire project. In November of 2003, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, a man named Hu Jintao, gave a speech in which he mentioned, almost in passing, that certain powers have all along encroached on and tried to control navigation through the Malacca Strait. That phrase, certain powers, was not a mystery to anyone in the room. He was talking about the United States Navy. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow corridor of water between Sumatra and the Malaysian Peninsula, about 800 kilometers long and at its narrowest point only 65 kilometers wide. Every year, more than 60,000 ships pass through it. That is roughly 25% of all the maritime trade on the planet squeezed through one shipping lane. And about 80% of every drop of crude oil that China imports passes through that single strait. Last year alone, China imported 11.6 million barrels of crude oil per day. More than 90% of it arrived by sea. The country that is on the verge of becoming the largest economy in the world is breathing through one straw. And that straw runs past navies that don't necessarily love it. Hu Jintao's speech got a name. It became known as the Malacca Dilemma. And the dilemma was simple to state and almost impossible to solve. China's economic survival ran through a waterway it did not control. You might wonder why China doesn't just go around it. The honest answer is that the geography won't let them. There are 3 other passages through the Indonesian archipelago. The Sunda Strait is too shallow and has dangerous tidal currents. The Lombok and Makassar Straits are deeper but much longer detours, and detours mean fuel and money. The northern sea route along the top of Russia is frozen most of the year and lacks infrastructure. China has spent enormous amounts of money building overland pipelines from Central Asia, from Russia, from Myanmar, from Pakistan. The China-Myanmar oil pipeline opened in 2013. The Kazakhstan-China pipeline has been running since 2006. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor connects the port of Gwadar to Xinjiang. Chains of port investments have been built across the Indian Ocean, often called the String of Pearls, in places like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Myanmar. All of it real, all of it expensive, and none of it enough. When you actually run the numbers, the pipelines together still carry only a small fraction of what the sea routes carry. The infrastructure is fragile. Some of it runs through unstable territory like Pakistan and post-coup Myanmar. The Malacca Dilemma, as a structural problem, is still wide open. So the question shifted. If you cannot bypass the choke point, how do you control it? And that is the question that the underwater Great Wall is, in a slow, indirect, multi-decade way, trying to answer. Because if China can hear every American submarine moving through the South China Sea, if it can map every approach to Malacca, if it can place sensors near Guam that hear the U.S. fleet leaving port, then the choke point stops being a one-sided vulnerability. It becomes contested ground. The wall isn't a barrier you cross. It's a layer of awareness that sits underneath everything that floats on top. And the US Navy is now starting to admit, in formal public testimony, that the awareness is working. On the 2nd of March, 2026, just a couple of months ago, Vice Admiral Richard Seif, the commander of US submarine forces, gave testimony before the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. The testimony is public, and the most striking thing about it is the tone. Seif doesn't use words like panic or crisis. Senior submariners don't talk that way, but he says, in plain language, that China is working to erode America's undersea advantage. He describes the underwater Great Wall as an integrated concept of fixed and mobile sensors, unmanned systems, and data fusion designed to increase the probability of detecting and tracking submarines in strategically valuable areas. And then he says the line that, if you read carefully, is the entire point. The likely effect, he says, is not transparency of the undersea environment, but a narrowing of the stealth margin, particularly near choke points, operating areas, and approaches that matter most in crisis and conflict. What that means, in normal English, is that American submarines, which have been the single most decisive asymmetric military advantage the United States has held over the last 50 years, are no longer guaranteed to be invisible. They will still be hard to find. They will still be lethal. But the margin between safe and detected is shrinking in exactly the places where it matters most. The waters around Taiwan, the approaches to Guam, the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea itself. These are the geographies where a war between the United States and China would actually be fought. And they are the geographies where China has spent the most effort listening. Rear Admiral Mike Brooks, who runs the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, was even more direct in his own testimony in early 2026. He told Congress that China's ocean surveying provides data that enables submarine navigation, concealment, and positioning of seabed sensors or weapons. He said that potential military intelligence collection by Chinese research vessels represents a strategic concern. For decades, the U.S. Navy could simply assume an asymmetric advantage in its knowledge of the ocean battlespace. That assumption is no longer safe. The deep ocean is no longer a free space for American operations. It is now contested, and the system is still being built. Because the most sophisticated piece of all of this isn't the sensors or the gliders or the buoys. It's the way they're being tied together. The Chinese have a name for the architecture. They call it the kill web. A kill web is different from what military planners used to call a kill chain. A kill chain is linear. A sensor detects a target. The data passes to a node that processes it. That node passes it to another node that decides what to do. That node passes the order to a weapon system that fires. The problem with a kill chain is that if you destroy any single link, the entire chain breaks. A kill web is a mesh. Every node connects to multiple other nodes. If you take one out, the data simply reroutes. PLA theorists have written explicitly that the goal is a maritime adaptive system that can survive losing pieces of itself. A study from the Dalian Naval Academy has demonstrated a strike model that can compute 45 alternative paths from sensor to shooter and rank them by speed. Another team developed an algorithm that automatically rebuilds broken chains by matching surviving nodes to the next best route. The system is designed not just to spot a submarine, but to keep functioning while parts of it are being destroyed. In August of 2025, the PLA Navy and the Russian Navy ran joint anti-submarine warfare drills near Vladivostok called Joint Sea 2025. During the drills, the two countries linked their communication systems and shared real-time tracks of weather, water conditions, and air-sea movement. Chinese state media described the goal as leaving deep-diving submarines with nowhere to hide. That phrase, nowhere to hide, has a specific meaning in this context. It is the operational version of Wu Lixin's transparent ocean. Now, it's worth being careful about how much of this works as advertised. The technology has limits. Acoustic communication underwater is slow. Cellular signals don't reach far offshore. Optical systems need clear water and precise alignment. Chinese researchers have made some claims about real-time data transmission that other Chinese scientists have publicly doubted. A specialist in underwater acoustics, interviewed by the South China Morning Post, openly questioned whether China had really achieved a breakthrough in underwater data transmission ahead of the United States. The truth is probably that the system works better in some places than others, that the integration between layers is uneven, that some of the more impressive claims are aspirational rather than operational. But that doesn't really change the trajectory. Chinese shipbuilding now outpaces American shipbuilding. The PLA Navy is closing the gap on quieting and propulsion. The sensors are being deployed. The kill web is being assembled piece by piece. And every year, the stealth margin narrows a little further. In April of 2026, just last month, the United States and Indonesia announced something they called a major defense cooperation partnership. The language was diplomatic and dry. Capacity building, education, exercises. The two militaries already conduct more than 170 joint exercises a year. The new agreement adds maintenance, repair, and overhaul support. It expands joint special forces training. And buried in the document is a phrase that explains its real purpose. The agreement focuses on, in its own words, maritime, subsurface, and autonomous systems. Translated out of diplomatic language, that means the United States is investing, quietly, in the human and technical infrastructure that would be needed if access through the Strait of Malacca ever came under pressure. It isn't an alliance. Indonesia has stressed its long-standing free and active foreign policy. But the agreement isn't really about treaties. It's about logistics and habits and relationships that would still function in a crisis. China has been building a wall on the sea floor. The United States is now building a counterweight on top of it. Here's the part that's easy to forget though. Despite all the testimony, despite all the satellite imagery, despite the leaked papers and the ship tracking data and the journal articles and the academic boasts, nobody outside of Chinese military planning circles really knows how complete the wall actually is. The full extent of the network has not been published. Some of the Chinese vessels involved in deploying it sometimes turn off their tracking systems, which means whatever Reuters could see is probably less than what's actually out there. Some of the sensors are publicly declared. Most of them are not. The South China Sea, in particular, has been deliberately wired. But how much of it is online, how much of it is operational, and how much of it is still under construction are questions that simply do not get answered in any open source. The ocean, in this case, is hiding the very thing that's designed to make oceans no longer hide things. And maybe that is the strangest part of the whole story. For most of human history, the deep ocean was the closest thing on Earth to outer space, almost unreachable. It was the one environment where stealth still genuinely worked, where an entire submarine carrying enough firepower to end a city could disappear for months and reappear somewhere else without warning. That space, that physical room for warships to hide, has been the structural foundation of nuclear deterrence and great power balance since the end of the Second World War. And that space is now slowly, deliberately, methodically being filled with eyes and ears. We don't know yet whether the underwater Great Wall will work the way its designers intend. Maybe the technology will hit walls that even Chinese engineers cannot get past. Maybe American countersensing will catch up. Maybe new submarine designs will find new ways to be quiet. The competition is just beginning, and history rarely runs in straight lines. But the question itself has changed. For the past 80 years, the question was whether the United States would maintain its undersea advantage in the Pacific. That question is now closed. The new question is whether anyone will. And when an admiral testifies that the goal is no longer dominance but resilience, no longer stealth but countersensing, no longer freedom of action but freedom of action under increasing risk, you are listening to the sound of a paradigm quietly cracking open. The deep ocean used to belong to no one. Now there are wires running through it. There are listening posts at the bottom of the deepest trench on the planet. There are robotic gliders patrolling for months at a time without a human aboard. There are satellites overhead, cueing sensors 3 kilometers underwater, and there are nations working in opposite directions, racing to decide who will hear what first. So, when you hear the phrase underwater Great Wall, don't think of it as a wall in the way you'd picture one above ground. It isn't a barrier, it isn't a line, it's a sense. It's the slow conversion of 3 million square kilometers of ocean into something that can be heard and read and understood and eventually predicted. It is the largest underwater surveillance network in the history of human warfare. It runs from the South China Sea to the approaches of Guam, from the underwater mountain ranges of the Indian Ocean to the entrance of the Arctic. And the strangest thing about it is how quietly it has all happened. There were no announcements. There were no ceremonies. Just a few state-owned shipbuilding press releases, a few academic papers, a glider washing up in an Indonesian fishing net, a sensor at the bottom of the deepest hole on Earth, listening, year after year, while the rest of the world looked the other way. We don't know how this story ends. We don't know if China will succeed in turning the ocean transparent. We don't know if the United States will close the gap or fall further behind. We don't know if the wall will hold or if some new piece of submarine technology will quietly slip past it. But we do know that the answer, whatever it ends up being, will reshape the balance of power in the Pacific for the rest of this century. And we'll get there eventually.